All right, we are back together on a Monday night. Hope everybody managed all right with the snow and is uh, set up for the cold weather in the week ahead. Obviously, please don't hesitate to reach out if we could be helpful in any way. It really is quite cold and has been quite snowy. Uh, in front of the bayit, our maintenance staff did an incredible job, and the area in front of the bayit is clear, but navigating the curbs, um, I think, is going to be a challenge for a little while. So just be mindful and plan ahead as you make your way about if you're in a snowy area. And we are returning to Dr. Brachi Elitzur and her essays on the Book of Shemot. This one gets a little in the weeds. I think it's one of those that when you read through it, it's hard to hold on to the precise details, or at least I found that. But the overall approach and analysis, I think, is really useful for helping us think about a series of episodes that really begin in Parshat Beshalach and pick up again in Bamidbar, continue through some of Shemot and pick up again in the book of Bamidbar. And it's a little bit of a longer essay, but the first half reads pretty quickly, and then we'll slow down a little, I think, in the second half. Let me share my screen.
I'll make it a little bit louder.
Okay, I switched to a Word document. I think it made it hopefully a little bit easier to read the text than on the web browser screen. And I'll read as we work through. This is an English translation, as with all the ones that we were doing in the Book of Shemot, an English translation of her Parashah essays on Bereshit and Shemot. So this is for Parshat Beshalach, and it has a sort of a provocative title: "You were rebellious," or "The kindness of your youth." These, I think, meant to be set as opposites, tracing the complaints of Am Yisrael in the desert. She begins: "The wandering journey of Am Yisrael in the desert is mentioned in many different places in Tanakh, but the evaluation of their coping with the trials and tribulations of the journey is not clear-cut," meaning the Torah's stance, or even the sages' stance, towards the way Bnei Israel deal with the challenges that they experience in their wilderness journeys. Kind of the stance on their reactions is, varies, as we'll see. When the sins of the golden calf and the spies are mentioned in historical speeches, they are treated as clear transgressions. But what is the status of the people's complaints and their demands for water, meat, and bread? Are these regarded as an ongoing misdeed on the part of the generation of the wilderness? Or did the prophetic leaders of the following generations show understanding for the trauma of a nation that had just emerged from the claws of the taskmasters and needed some time for adjustment? Did they show sympathy for the needs of nomads facing the hardships of the desert? It's the question she's essentially asking is, when we read the text both in real time and in subsequent, in the prophets and in other places, when it relates back to Bnei Israel's, for lack of a better word, complaining in the wilderness about their lack of sustenance, is the text, or are the texts, critical of that complaining, or more understanding or neutral about that complaining? Are their complaints in the wilderness considered to be acts of wrongdoing, or are they understood a little bit more within their context, as understandable, excusable, given either their overall historical context, they're just emerging from slavery, or the immediate context, they really didn't have anything to eat or drink, so what would you expect them to do or say? These are sort of the questions, and I think it's maybe we can think about it more broadly, as a question about how we, in other circumstances, relate to complaining or frustrations in times of scarcity of resources. Complaints vis-a-vis the leadership, do we look at them more critically or with more sympathy and justification? That's sort of the question, with the wilderness experiences here as the focus. So she begins with a positive frame. Yirmiyahu's depiction of Am Yisrael as a cherished bride is well known. And so says the Lord, I remember in your favor the kindness of your youth. Zacharti lach chesed nu'ulaich. We say it on Rosh Hashanah. Your love as a bride when you followed me in the desert in a land that was not sowed. All right, so that's a positive frame. We didn't do anything wrong. We put up with the hardships in a way that God looks back towards favorably. In contrast, we also find harsh criticism of the nation's stubbornness, ingratitude, rebelliousness, and transgressions. For instance, we're going to read through a briefly narrated litany of quotes here, so I'll move a little bit quickly. For instance, in Yechezkel's historical survey, there are stinging accusations of violating God's statutes and judgments. This is the quote from Yechezkel chapter 20. But the house of Israel rebelled against me in the desert. They did not follow my statutes, and they despised my judgments, which a person should perform to live by them. They desecrated my Shabbatot greatly, and I declared that I would pour out my anger upon them in the wilderness to consume them. The psalmist also emphasizes the nation's ingratitude. We get two passages from Tehillim here, one less familiar from Tehillim 78, which kind of poetically narrates the wilderness experience, and then Tehillim 95, which will be familiar to us from Kabbalat Shabbat, the first one. God divided the sea and caused them to pass through, stationing the water in a heap, and led them with a cloud by day and all night with a light of fire. God split rocks in the wilderness and gave them to drink as from great depths, and brought forth streams from rocks. I guess this he might be Moshe, I'm not sure, lowercase h, causing water to run down like rivers. But they sinned further against God, rebelling in the wilderness against the Most High, and they tested God in their hearts, seeking food for their craving. And they spoke against God, saying, Can God set a table in the wilderness? Behold, God smote rock, and water flowed, and streams gushed forth. Can God then also give bread? Can God provide meat for God's people? And then from Tehillim 95, Do not harden your hearts, as in Merivah on the day of Massah in the wilderness, when your forefathers tried me, tested me, even though they saw my deeds. For 40 years I loathed this generation, and said, They are people who err in their heart, and they do not know my ways. I therefore swore in my anger that they should not enter my place of rest. And then even Psalm 106, They soon forgot God's deed and did not wait for God's counsel. They had a lustful desire in the wilderness and tried God in the desert. Similarly, so those were Tehillim quotes, we find in Nehemiah's historical speech summarizing the nation's history this quote from Nehemiah chapter 9, You gave them bread from the heavens for their hunger and brought forth water for them from the rock of their thirst. And you told them that they would go and take possession of the land which you had promised to give them. But they and their forefathers acted with arrogance and stiffened their necks and did not obey your commandments. And they refused to obey, nor did they pay heed to your wonders which you performed with them, stiffening their necks and appointing a leader in their rebellion to return to their slavery. Okay, so if we're tallying up, we have a lot more critical views than neutral or positive views of the Israelites' wilderness, attitudes, but we do see both perspectives. In Sefer Dvarim, we find Moshe's repetition of the Torah after he led the nation during their years of wandering and experienced firsthand their complaints. Here again, the evaluation of their conduct is not clear-cut. Okay, so now we're going to zero into kind of one frame, which is Moshe's, end of career final speeches to Bnei Israel, and we're going to see both attitudes. To their immediate past, the 40 years that he just led them through. His opening speech includes scathing criticism of the nation's response to the report of the spies, but there is no reproach for the nation's complaints concerning water, meat, and bread. Further on, Moshe mentions the period of wandering and God's concern for all the nation's needs, but with no hint of rebuke, as we see in Dvarim chapter 2. For the Lord your God, by the way, we know we're far afield here from Parshat Beshalach, but what we'll see is that she uses Parshat Beshalach as a kind of a springboard to analyze a series of the events of Bnei Israel's complaints in the wilderness that start from Beshalach and go all the way through, pick up again in Bamidbar. So looking back on all of that, Moshe says in Devarim, For the Lord your God has blessed you in all of your endeavors. God knows you're journeying through this great wilderness. For these 40 years, the Lord your God has been with you. You have lacked nothing. In fact, when Moshe expresses his concern at the possibility of the nation forgetting God in light of their future prosperity, in Eretz Yisrael, he recalls the hardships of the wilderness from a perspective of absolute understanding of the people's difficulties during the period of wandering, with no reproach for the way they handled the challenges that faced them. Here we have another quote of Moshe from later on in Dvarim. You shall remember the way in which the Lord your God has led you for these 40 years in the wilderness to afflict you, to test you, in order to know what was in your heart, whether you would observe God's commandments or not. God afflicted you and brought you hunger, fed you man, which was unknown to you and your fathers, in order to make it known to you that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from God's mouth does man live. Your garments did not wear out upon you, nor did your feet swell throughout these 40 years. You shall therefore know in your heart that as a man chastens his son, so the Lord your God chastens you. And you shall observe the commandments of the Lord your God to follow God's ways and to fear him. And then just a little later in that same chapter, God who led you in the great and terrible wilderness of snakes, serpents, and scorpions, and drought where there is no water, who brought forth water for you from the flint rock, who fed you man in the wilderness, which was unknown to your fathers, in order to afflict you and in order to test you, that God might grant you goodness at your end. Now, we could just sort of say that the reactions of the Israelites here is overlooked because the lens or the camera angle is on God, but still it's notable that any criticism is absent. Elsewhere, however, Moshe rebukes the nation strongly for their actions during the 40 years of wandering. In the speech in which he explains the reason for their inheritance of the land, he rules out the possible notion that it was because of your righteousness and the uprightness of your heart that you come to inherit their land. He supports this with a description of the nation's rebellion in the wilderness. Remember, do not forget how you provoked the Lord your God in the wilderness from the day when you came out of the land of Egypt until you came to this place. You have been rebellious against God. Mamrim hayitem. Thus, the record of the nation's complaints, now quoting again from the immediate preceding verse, from the day when you came out of the land of Egypt until the entry in Eretz Yisrael, does not provide us with an unequivocal answer to our question, right? So just summarizing all of the above from various texts across the Tanakh, even from Dvarim itself, looking back, there are neutral perspectives on Bnei Yisrael's wilderness journeys and the challenges they faced, and there are critical perspectives. Likewise, God's responses to the complaints are not consistent. Okay, now sort of jumping to a different view, reflecting on the narratives themselves. When Bnei Yisrael complain in all these different kinds of settings, God's responses are not consistent. Some complaints lead to a miracle that fulfills the nation's requests. Sometimes the response to a complaint is dependent on their fulfillment of a series of commands. And in other times, God acquiesces to their request, but punishes them for complaining. The sense of uncertainty in evaluating the nation's religious performance in the wilderness would seem to arise, now she's going to begin her analysis, from a mistaken generalization of their complaints, ignoring the unique elements of each of them, right? Thus far, she is imagining the reader just kind of saying, okay, there's a bunch of complaints in the wilderness, and the texts either, are neutral or are critical of them. But that assumes that they're all the same, and they're not. The complaints seem to all be of a similar nature, representing a situation of some deficiency, right? Absence of food, of water, of meat, that causes bread, water, and meat, that causes the nation to complain and to recall and long for Egypt, and to claim that those who brought them out of Egypt acted for the nation's detriment. Indeed, in terms of the general external appearance of the complaints, they are similar. In order to arrive at an answer to the question that we posed at the outset concerning the seemingly ambivalent attitude of the text, right? If they're all the same and yet sometimes the text seems to be critical and sometimes not, it doesn't make sense. So we'll resort to questioning that assumption of whether they're all the same. We must categorize the complaints in such a way as to evaluate their various parameters. In this shiur, so that was all a preamble, in this shiur, we will compare the 9 stories of complaints that occur during the nation's journey with attention to the unique elements of each of them. Okay? Pursuit by the Egyptians, so kicking off in this week's Parsha with kind of standing at the sea with the Egyptians chasing them down, and they've got the Egyptians on one side and the sea on the other. How do they respond? Mara, right, that's the bitter waters, and also in this week's Parsha. Also in this week's Parsha, the wilderness of Sin, that's a whole chapter of complaint about meat and food, etc. And the man figures there as well. Rifidim, another complaint about water, also in this week's Parsha. And then skipping to the book of Bamidbar is basically not really much complaining. The rest of Shemot, we move on to Yitro and then Mishpatim, and we have the instructions for the construction of the tabernacle. So the sort of wilderness narratives kind of stop after Beshalach, and then Vayikra, all of priestly and sacrificial laws. In Bamidbar, it really begins with the order of the camp and the census. That takes us through the first 10 chapters. And in Parshat Bahalotcha, in chapter 11, as the wandering begins, the complaints begin. So we have the story of Taveira, we have the story of Kivrot HaTava, the graves of lust, we have the story of the spies, we have the story of the waters of Merivah, and then the circuitous route around the land of Edom, where various kinds of complaints situate themselves. So 9 stories. We'll examine the information alluded to in the text, helping the reader to discern the level of justification for each complaint. We will compare the ways in which the people make their requests or demands, and the character of those making these requests or demands. We will look at God's different responses in each case. All of this will help us to understand the reason for the varying evaluation of Am Yisrael during their period of wandering, meaning why if some texts are critical and some are not, maybe they're zeroing in on different kinds of responses or different kinds of circumstances. Attached at the end of this shiur is a table comparing the elements of the complaint in each of the 9 instances listed. Readers are encouraged to consult the table over the course of the shiur. And again, in the link that was sent out that has the shiur, you have the table at the end. So it's something worth really referring back to. Part of what I liked about this essay is it provides us a rubric and a framework that, for a series of parshiot, for hours Beshalach, and then a bunch in Bamidbar, we could come back to and look at this analysis. And here it goes. Description of the situation prompting the complaint. Our first parameter for comparison is the textual description. By the way, I'll say one other thing, it reminds me, Robert Alter in, I assume it's in The Art of Biblical Narrative, talks about archetypal, I think that's the right term he uses there, archetypal or maybe biblical type scenes. The announcement of a birth, the, relationship established at a well, and one of his central points is that the overall similarities are there to establish a theme, and then try to draw our eye to the differences between each in order to notice the unique features of any given story. I don't know if he ever discusses complaint stories, but I think she's drawing off of a similar framework to sort of say, at the face of it, these all look the same, but when we examine the closer details, along a certain set of varying parameters, we can understand what the text might want us to be drawing our attention to, and how we might evaluate in each case the degree of critique we would have towards the complaints. So our first parameter for comparison is the textual description of the situation that invites the complaint. Right? How does the Torah actually describe the deficiency that Bnei Israel are going to be complaining about? As the table shows, in 3 out of 9 instances, wilderness of Sin, Taveira, and the graves of lust, there's no prior description of the situation, suggesting that the complaint does not arise from any objective reality that oppresses the nomads. Right? In other words, it doesn't say there was a great famine or there was nothing to eat. It just says Bnei Israel complained that there was nothing to eat. Now, there's a rabbinic, I think it's a rabbinic saying that Divrei Torah aniyim b'makom achad v'ashirim b'makom acher. They're impoverished in one place and enriched in another. And that means a few different things. But one of the things it can mean is sometimes you don't get a whole story. Maybe you get it further detailed somewhere else. But I think you could even say sometimes you don't get all the elements of a story for any of a variety of reasons, not that they're not there. So she attempts to argue here that if it says that Bnei Israel complained about something, but the Torah hasn't told us about that reality previously, then that means they were really complaining about something that wasn't such a big deal. I don't think you have to say that, but I think she's right to make this differentiation. When you see a narrative of complaint, is the thing Bnei Israel are complaining about already described in the text as a reality, or are we only aware of the thing they're complaining about through their own complaint? Ramban comments on the absence of any record of the situation facing the nation in the wilderness of Tzin. This is a quote from the Ramban. And the entire congregation of Bnei Israel murmured against Moshe. The text fails to narrate the beginnings of the story of the complaint, as it does at Marah and Rephidim, right, where it says, there was no water, and in all the other complaints, such that we would read here, and there was no meat to eat and no bread with which to be satisfied, and the nation was hungry for food, right? We don't get that detail here, or narration here, introduction here. The Ramban proposes that we judge the complainers favorably, viewing the very mention of the wilderness of Tzin as hinting to the reason for the complaint, the distance from Egypt and any place of habitation, and the fear of facing conditions of starvation. Meaning, so in the Ramban's framework, yes, the narrator doesn't tell us, but that's all hinted at from the fact that we're told where we are, the wilderness of Tzin. That's already explains why Bnei Israel are in such a difficult situation, and therefore it's as though we did have the introduction of their difficult circumstances, and that justifies their complaint. However, says Dr. Elitzur, we propose that the nation's request is actually presented in a critical light, contra the Ramban, through the juxtaposition of this complaint to the description of the abundance of water and food at their previous station, Elim. They came to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees, and they encamped there by the water. The juxtaposition suggests that the complaint did not arise from any objective shortage. Again, it's a little bit of a leap, so saying they just came from a place where they were totally totally satisfied, totally nourished. So how could their circumstances have changed so fast? We might compare this to a complaint where the text does begin with a description of the situation. The Torah goes into great detail in its description of the Egyptians pursuing Bnei Israel in a manner which conveys very clearly the terror that engulfs them. Right. So this is the heart of our Parsha, the beginning of our Parsha. Bnei Israel have been freed from Egypt. They're on their way, and now it says the Egyptians chase after them. All of Paro's horses and chariots and his horsemen and his army, and they caught up with them as they encamped by the sea at Piach before Baal Tzifon. Paro drew closer, and Bnei Israel lifted their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were journeying after them. Right, so there is a situation where the narration, you can already feel they're in an impossible position. They're being borne down upon by the enemy. The sea is at their backs. They're stuck. So their then fear is one that we the readers already are sympathetic to. The complaint at Marah is voiced after 3 days of journeying in the desert without water, with not a word of protest on the part of the nomads. They grow desperate only after the longed-for source of water appears, and they discover that it cannot quench their thirst, right? The water was bitter. In the case of the complaint following the report of the spies, there's a description of the situation, but the text emphasizes that the report is slanderous, and that there were those among the spies who took pains to disprove the slander and to calm the nation's fears, right? So there we get some of the context, but it's equivocal because there's different perspectives to it. So those who are complaining, there's a counter narrative that perhaps they should have taken up. When it comes to the journey around the land of Edom, the complaint is accompanied by a description of the objective situation with no explanation for the nation's impatience. Thus, the exposition of each of the narratives provides us with some clues as to the varying levels of justification. Again, this is really a kind of a survey essay, so she's not, giving us top to bottom of each story. She's laying out the kinds of contextual clues that we want to look for when we look at each of these complaint stories. So we're not going to sort of come away with a final conclusion here, but we're being introduced to a range of perspectives to think about. Okay, so the first was called description of the situation prompting the complaint. Now the second one is called the reference to the complainers. How are they called? Above, we examine the description of the situation prior to the complaint as one indication of the degree to which the complaint is justified. Even if the complaint is justified, and all the more so if it is not, the manner in which it's voiced and the identity of those voicing it are also important parameters for our evaluation. The text refers to the complainers in different ways, and this is no coincidence. There are 4 different groupings, right? So across the 9 stories, the people who are voicing the complaint, what does the Torah call them? Bnei Yisrael, the nation, Ha'am, the entire congregation of Bnei Israel, or the entire congregation, Kol Ha'idah, or Kol Adat Bnei Israel, and the Rifraf, Asaf Suf. These appellations serve to distinguish between instinctive, spontaneous complaints that are voiced by people in distress, referred to as Bnei Israel or the nation, and an organized coalition, referred to as the entire congregation of Bnei Israel. Okay, again, this is a leap and an interpretation, right? We might just say these are textual variations. There's all kinds of different reasons why the group might be called different things. She wants to try to, read this closely, and therefore suggests, a generic, a generic term like Bnei Israel or the nation shows kind of a spontaneous response. But if they are the collected people, Ha'asaf Suf, or Kol Adat B'nai Israel, the entire assembly, that already suggests that there's an organized response, that they got together and said, how are we going to respond to this? Let's complain. That's a little exaggeration, but that's the idea she wants to get across. Ramban notes these different appellations. By the way, she quotes a few Rambans, and this is, as medieval commentaries go, I think this is a very Ramban-esque kind of approach, in that it connects a series of narratives, a series of psukim, with these kinds of readings. Even though the Ramban certainly was of the school of thought that sometimes things, there's natural textual variation, and so not everything has to be read in such a maximalist way. But the overall approach here, I think, accords most with the Ramban, which is why we're seeing more Ramban quoted than Rashi or Ibn Ezra or the like. Bnei Israel cried out to God. For those among them who were righteous cried out to God, while the rest rebelled against God's word. Therefore, the text states further on, the nation feared God. This is from our Parshat, at the splitting of the sea, and they believed in God and in Moshe, God's servant. It doesn't say Yisrael feared God and they believed, but rather the nation. For Bnei Israel is a reference to a group of individuals, while the nation is the name for the collective. And we see this also in the nation murmured. Chazal also mention the nation began to go astray. Wherever the text says the nation, it is a term of disapproval. Where it says Yisrael, it is a term of praise. Okay, so it's a slight difference from how she laid it out initially, in which she considered the nation as potentially less blameworthy. The appellation Rifraf, Asaf Suf, likewise hints at an organized initiative, right? Asaf meaning gathering, a gathered, organized group. Again, could also read it totally the opposite way, as kind of this loose collection, this disorganized motley crew, so to speak, as Asaf Suf. And here she's reading it as much more organized, a marginal troublemaking group. The varying terms used for the groups of complainers provides us with another yardstick for evaluating their level of justification. The more coordination and planning has been invested in the complaint, the less justified it is, because where the distress is real and existential, a person cries out spontaneously. He doesn't wait to coordinate his protest with others and to gain their support. Now, again, we could critique that. Protest movements sometimes take time and organization, and there are things that are worth protesting about, even if it's not spontaneous. But I think her argument here is, given that the subject here is not moral rights or wrongs, but literally just a scarcity of, basic necessities. So when you don't have that, you cry out right away, then, that clearly shows that it's coming from distress. If you kind of wait a while and protest in a more organized way, it maybe shows that the need is not quite as dire. That's the argument she's making here. The nature of the complaint. Okay, so we've already touched on the who's making the complaint and how does the text frame the context of the complaint. Now we're going to get to the content of the complaint itself. The actual act of complaint is also depicted in the text in different ways. They cried out or they murmured sound more legitimate than acts of lust, weeping, or rebellion. Ramban notes this distinction. This is, and again, we could easily critique these also. Litzok sounds like an instinctive, cry of distress. To murmur, maybe is a little bit more grumbly. Maybe that's a little bit less instinctive. This is the meaning of the verse, the nation quarreled with Moshe. For the complaints occurring in places where we read that they murmured are instances of disgruntlement. The people were disgruntled about some issue. What shall we do? What shall we eat? What shall we drink? But they quarreled means that they actually confronted him. At Refidim, we find a dual description of the action of the complainers. At first they quarreled, and then they murmured. The episode of Refidim is substantially similar to the episode at Marah. In both instances, there's a prior description of a shortage of water, and only afterwards a description of the effect of this shortage on the state of the people. However, the description of the shortage at Marah does not prompt a complaint. This comes only after the description of the distress experienced in the wake of the shortage. At Refidim, the complaint comes even before there is a description of the distress. It would seem that Moshe's rebuke, "Why do you quarrel with me?" occurring in between the two expressions of complaint, is what changes the nature of the quarrel itself. The expression that follows, "and the nation were thirsty and the nation murmured," seems to be expressed in a less confrontational way, and only when the existential distress has spread throughout the nation, right? So it seems like she's sort of suggesting it wasn't so severe, and they were just kind of fighting with Moshe, and Moshe says, "What are you fighting with me for?" And then it gets less confrontational and more existentially distressing. At Tavera, the people are explicitly described as complainers, mitonanim, which leaves no doubt as to their motives. And of course, the same applies to those who lusted a lust, right? So there people, again, there might be some cause, but the emphasis of the text is on their complaint and not on the justified cause, so to speak. In the story of the spies, 4 different verbs are used to describe what the nation does, reflecting an escalation. The entire congregation lifted and sounded their voices, and the nation wept on that night, and all of Bnei Israel murmured against Moshe and against Aaron, right? So we have underlined the different terms for the grouping and bolded the verbs. Intratextual exegesis can aid us in understanding the process leading up to the complaint. So when Moshe reflects back on the story of the scouts in Devarim, he says, "You grumbled in your tents, and you said it was out of God's hatred for us that God brought us out of the land of Egypt to give us into the hand of the Amorites to annihilate us." It seems that the slander spoken by the spies did not filter its way to every part of the nation. It is the congregation that fans the nation's fear into the flame of rebellion. The expression, "they sounded their voices and wept," recalls the act of the weepers, whose role was to arouse weeping among others. Meaning I think she's referring to weepers in other contexts, that at funerals and things you have, assigned people whose job it is to evoke crying amongst others. I think she's saying that's how we are meant to understand the weeping here, as trying to arouse complaint in others. The congregation achieves only partial success. The nation wept. It's only towards morning that the intimidation campaign is complete among all of Bnei Israel. So she wants to read it as egging on the congregation, the whole community, to complain when things weren't actually that bad. It wasn't so warranted. The complaint at Mei Merivah starts with a moderate description of a gathering, with no indication of the identity of those involved. Only afterwards does the Torah describe an action of quarreling on the nation's part. In the complaint at Refidim, Moshe's rebuke draws a distinction between 2 actions of complaint, while at Mei Merivah no such distinction exists. This may indicate a difference between the 2 groups of complainers, as indeed we see from the continuation of the verses, where there's a distinction between God's command to gather the congregation and the execution. Moshe and Aaron gathered the company. Malbim comments, again, reading on the distinction between the groups. As I have already explained, there's a difference between Eidah and Kahal. It's probably a worthy comment to note on its own right. They are called Eidah when they appear in the proper hierarchy, led by the elders. They are then called Eidah in deference to the Sanhedrin, who are the most important among them. They're called Kahal when the masses gather without the proper hierarchy, without their elders leading them. The nation circumventing the land of Edom, okay, so there, again, this distinction God says, gather the congregation. Moshe and Aaron are gathering the kahal, who are this more disorganized. They're the complainers who are not kind of following their leaders. The nation circumventing the land of Edom is not described as complaining, but the emphasis on the speaking against God and Moshe, Belokim uve Moshe, rather than to El, God and to Moshe, indicates rebellion, right? So here she's just kind of like diverged to a different mechanism of analysis and said, look at the actual preposition that describes the relationship they're speaking against as opposed to speaking to. That's indicative of what makes it sort of more rebellious, even though there's not a term for complaint there. Indeed, this interpretation is reflected in the translation of both Onkelos and the Targum Yonatan. Okay. The concreteness, we're about 2/3 of the way there. The concreteness of the complaint represents a further yardstick for evaluation. I think this is a particularly interesting point, and I think very much relevant to common discourse. The concreteness of the complaint represents a further yardstick for evaluation. At Marah we hear, "What shall we drink?" And at Refidim, "Give us water that we may drink." Seemingly a more aggressive demand, but in fact indicating faith in the power of the leadership to provide solutions to the problem, as opposed to the helplessness reflected in the first two complaints. What are we supposed to do, kind of thing. In contrast, we encounter pseudo-complaints, where the people are as complainers, or complaints that do not address the actual aim, but rather a longing for an unattainable reality. Who can feed us meat? Right, so here she's asking us to draw our attention to what do they actually say? Are the words, are they rhetorical questions just indicating a lack of faith, or are they a specific concrete request for the thing which is missing? Right. Why do you never let me XYZ as opposed to can I please XYZ? Any mention of Egypt, okay, description of Egypt and the attitude towards the Exodus. Any mention of Egypt by the complainers as a justification for their complaint is a sign of ingratitude and indicates their distorted judgment and selective memory. Even here, however, a distinction must be drawn. It's really, I think, an interesting distinction between complainers who recall Egypt as the object of their aspirations and as the land of unlimited food opportunities. That's the bad one. And those who invoke Egypt as an alternative to death. Egypt is depicted as a desired destination in 4 of the complaints. But whereas the newly liberated Bnei Israel speak of Egypt in comparison with a place where they're going to be killed, right? Why did you take us out of here to die? Let us stay back in Egypt. That's not saying, oh, we miss Egypt, we love Egypt, Egypt had all the good stuff that we want. It's just a way of saying, we don't have our basic necessities, and at least in Egypt we were surviving. That's a much less complainy, extreme way of invoking Egypt. The complaints in the wilderness of Tzin, at the graves of Lust, and in the journey around the land of Edom, Egypt is described as preferable to the wilderness as a place to live. An interesting development occurs in the complaint at Mei Meriva. The younger generation refuses to buy the imaginary, demagogic description of the pleasures of Egypt as offered by their parents. Their complaint pertains purely to the difficulties of the wilderness as a place that devours its inhabitants. I think, if I recall correctly, we saw a Parsha essay that pointed this out. I can't remember if it was Rav Avital Hachstein or a different one, but I remember seeing an essay that pointed out these distinctions in the attitude towards Egypt as indicative of the progress of Bnei Israel. I think it may have been a different Gush affiliated Parsha commentary. As noted, a comparison of the conditions in the wilderness and those in Egypt is to be found in only 4 of the complaints, but Egypt is invoked to back up the complaint in almost every instance. Nevertheless, here too there is a difference between a questioning of the point of the Exodus, right? Why did you take us out of Egypt? And a longing to return, with absolute disregard for the years of suffering and servitude, depicting Egypt as a fantasy that epitomizes the realization of the desert nomad's wishes. The nation glancing back fearfully at the Egyptians in pursuit, and the complainers at Refidim, question the meaning of their salvation. They express their preference for slavery over the prospect of death. This comparison makes sense and sounds like an expression of desperation in view of the armed pursuit, right, at the Yam Suf, or the terrible thirst at Rephidim that threatened them. The complainers in the wilderness of Tzin compare the food possibilities of the two situations. Seemingly, the comparison here is once again logical. Egypt, with its well-developed sources of sustenance, does indeed offer better opportunities for feeding the nation than does the desolate wilderness. However, the complainers do not suffice with an objective description of the differences, which itself would be quite convincing. Rather, they become carried away and exaggerate. As we sat at the flesh pot, eating bread to satiety in Egypt, right, which we assume was not the reality. At this point, their complaint enters the realm of demagoguery. The complaint of the riffraff, the Asafsuf, is more serious. While the comparison raised by the complainers in the wilderness of Tzin pits the threat of death posed by the desolation of the wilderness against their confidence in the possibilities for sustenance offered by Egypt. The complainers at the graves of lust compare the quality of life in both places. Of course, quality of life is judged by many different parameters, but the complainers choose just one that gives Egypt an advantage over life in the wilderness. And even that one element is described with wild exaggeration, with disdain for the divine miracles that attempt to create material conditions in the wilderness to in some way recreate what they had in Egypt. The complaint of the spies, and you can see her, she's just working through the individual cases. The complaint of the spies represents a further stage in this line of complaint, and it reaches its climax, and this is often, we've seen the one that she's pointed to as the least justified of the complaints, and the most kind of rallying the people to complain rather than a instinctive, distress-based complaint. So the complaint of the spies represents a further stage in this line of complaint, and it reaches its climax here in two respects. First, the congregation does not describe the advantages of Egypt only in comparison with life in the wilderness. Rather, they present Egypt as an alternative, preferable even to Eretz Yisrael. When they cry, "Our wives and our little ones will be for prey," they seem to have forgotten the decree of their former captors. "Every boy that is born to you shall you cast into the Nile." And Pharaoh's refusal to release the women and children to go and sacrifice in the desert along with the men. Not so. Go now, the men, and serve God. Second, the complaint of the congregation in the wake of the spies' report introduces an element of activist planning. Let us appoint a leader and return to Egypt. Nitana rosh v'nashuva mitzrayma. This represents a clear violation of the divine command, for as you have seen Egypt today, you shall not see it again forever. The complaint of the younger generation at Mei Merivah represents a tikkun, a repairing of the sin of the spies. There is no longer any longing for Egypt. Rather, there is a desire to realize the purpose of the Exodus, to bring to a place of sowing and figs and grapes and pomegranates. Right? Why did you take us out of Egypt? But to bring us, we want you to get us to that place. In the complaint over the circuitous route around the land of Edom, there is a regression. While the people do not mention any possibility of returning to Egypt, the younger generation just about to enter the land is expected to be future-oriented rather than focused on the past. The complaint that they might be expected to offer in the face of a reality where the nation grew impatient with the way is a request for some shortcut to Eretz Yisrael, the place of sowing and figs and grapes and pomegranates, a land flowing with milk and honey. Instead, the people complain about the difficult conditions of the wilderness and expect that this will change, right? Let them just say, hurry up and get us to Israel, as opposed to why are we stuck here and things are so bad here. Results of the complaint. We're nearing the end here. God's response varies with the nature of each complaint. This certainly makes sense. We would expect, that one of the clearest ways of sensing, how we judge the complaint is how does God judge the complaint? What's God's response? The aim of God's response is to fulfill the nation's request when it is justified, as in the pursuit of the Egyptians at Marah, Rephidim, and Mei Merivah, right? They needed to be saved from the Egyptians. They had bitter water. They needed to be able to drink. Needed to be able to drink in the other cases. Or to uproot the source of the sin when the complaint is unjustified or where the claim accompanying it is misguided. Bnei Israel, pursued by the Egyptians' fear for their lives, and God's response neutralizes the source of their terror. The root Resh Aleph Hey, to see, is a key word in Moshe's speech to the people. Indeed, that, by the way, that harkens back to our first essay, that Moshe believed that speech alone wasn't enough. It wasn't just that he was saying, I have difficulty speaking. He was saying that people need more than convincing words. They need to be shown things. So this relates back to her point in that essay, right, where it's what they see that convinces them. Indeed, the sight of the complete disappearance of the threat is what restores their faith in Moshe's leadership in the wilderness. The complaint at Marah may express the nation's concern that the plague of blood in Egypt may have contaminated all the water in the region. An interesting reading. The complainers demonstrate greatness in that they make no mention of any desire to return to Egypt. God's response to their complaint includes giving them the rules of statute and judgment, which will shield them from all the illness which I placed upon Egypt. So this is a little portal to a further analysis of the Marah story and why it's relating, their reading their concern about the bitter waters is somehow linking back to a continuation of things they experienced in Egypt. And that's why God sort of says, no, there's law and order, there's rules, and if you follow those things, you won't have anything that you had back in Egypt. So there's a bigger analysis here that she's pointing towards. The root of the sin in the wilderness of Tzin is the longing for the flesh pots and satiety of Egypt. God's response comes in the form of an accumulation of food that is posed as the antithesis of the flesh pot ideology of material gorging, placing meat and the desire for satiety at the center of one's day-to-day existence. The framework within which the quails and the man descend limits the time for gathering and the quantity that may be gathered, thereby turning the food into a means of survival rather than the center of existence, right? So it's a kind of the response is a sort of a corrective. The complaints at Taberah and the graves of lust bring punishments, which strengthen the same idea that was not sufficiently well inculcated in the lessons of man and the quail. God's response allows the people to enjoy the flesh pots and experience ongoing satiety, with a view to making them understand that in fact a situation that includes limits is preferable. The uprooting of the sin of the spies through the punishment meted out to them is stated explicitly by God. The punishment for despising the good land will create a situation of ongoing, unrealized longing to be able to settle there, right? The Torah God describes the punishment as Yom Lashana, for the 40 years that they were there, 40 days that they were there and brought back a negative report, we'll have 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. The poisonous serpents that attack the complainers who must circumvent the land of Edom come to repair the nation's ingratitude, as expressed in their expression, measly bread for the man. God leads them to an encounter with the true conditions of the wilderness, the great and terrible wilderness with snakes, serpents, and scorpions, right? So her reading here of the why were they struck with these these snakes, to say, you're critical of the way I took care of you in the wilderness. Here, have a taste of what the wilderness is really like as I expose you to snakes. In order to awaken in their hearts the recognition of God's kindness throughout their period of wandering, and that which is destined to happen as a result of their impatience at the remainder of the journey to a place of habitation. Okay, conclusion. Parshat Beshalach describes the climax of the process of the Exodus, the sight of those who had enslaved Bnei Israel drowning before their eyes. Our expectations of the generation which experienced the great trials, those great signs and wonders, are very high, and our encounter with their complaints and their requests to return to Egypt later on in the Parashah are disappointing. The complaints of the first year, concentrated in one single Parashah, ours, amplify this sense of disappointment and arouse our sympathy for Moshe and his rebuke at the plains of Moab. Since the day you came of Egypt until you came here, you have been rebellious towards God. However, along with this disappointment, we hear the echoing words of Yirmiyahu. I remember in your favor the kindness of your youth, your love as a bride, when you followed me in the desert in a land that was not sown. This effusion of praise demands that we undertake anew an unmediated reading of the stories of the complaints, with an attempt to understand the aspects of innocence and devotion that were also part of the journey. A renewed look at the stories of the complaints and a comparison between them helps us to differentiate between real objective complaints and false ones, between spontaneous anguish and calls to rebellion, and between requests for help and expressions of complaint. Most of all, this analysis helps us to place the issue of gratitude over the past and present as a yardstick for judging the complainers. You have been rebellious applies to the complaints when the nation did not remember your wonders which you performed for them, and they stiffened their necks and appointed leaders to return to their servitude out of rebellion. The kindness of your youth describes the innocent cry of the people in distress, feeling that their very lives are at stake, who only then cry out to Moshe, "What shall we drink?" Okay, so in her closing, she argues that the different texts that have the different attitudes, critical or appreciative slash understanding, are reflective of the fact that there were different kinds of complaints, and the texts that reflect back on them don't differentiate between them, but from the different attitudes we could imagine that they are that there were different kinds or qualities, contexts for the complaining, and she tried to help us look at some textual tools. Does the narrative provide an objective description of the setting? Who are the people who are complaining? What is God's response? What's the nature of the complaint? A series of different. How does an orientation about Egypt? How does Egypt figure in? Is it just a recognition that there we were still alive and here we feel like we're going to die, or was it really it was great there and we want to go back there? These are different parameters to consider as we look at these episodes of complaint in our Parsha and in the middle of Bamidbar, and analyze them. Questions, comments? Thanks for bearing with me for a long essay. Lance, keeping quiet? There we go. Go ahead and unmute. Yep.
Okay. My first comment, and the main comment I have, is a plague on both your houses. Because it seems to me that the Egyptians and the Israelites and a whole lot of other people are subject to God's plagues. For example, the little blizzard we just experienced, 19 people died. We have a cold, the plague of the cold, the plague of the snow. In Minneapolis, there's the plague of ice. In Iran, there's the plague of the Ayatollah Khomeini. And it seems to me that my friend Rabbi Shmuley Boteach asked the question, where was God on October 7th, 2023? I asked the question, where was God on October 7th, 1944?
Yes.
Okay. And so we've got a situation here where we're looking at a text that presents basically a benevolent God who says, well, okay, if you listen to me and you do everything right, then you'll get a good thing. And I personally adhere to Kohelet, as Rabbi Sachs points out. The only thing that a human being can do from Kohelet's point of view is simcha, communal simcha. And that's it. No protests, no bomb droppings. The only thing you've got in this world is simcha. And I just would like to say that Samuel Johnson in Rassless says, human life is everywhere a state in which much is to be endured and little to be enjoyed.
Thank you. Yeah, certainly a lot of hard things out there right now to be challenged by and question. So I appreciate you raising that. Absolutely. David L.
Well, I'd like to say something.
Yes, please.
If I may. At the beginning of our nation, the situation is totally different. Hashem is forming our nation, and that is a radically different situation than we have now with the ice storm or what's happening in Iran, what happened on February 7th. there's one thing about the beginning of the nation when the nation is not aware of what they should do. They have no training of being a nation. And now, after 3,000 plus years, where that information should be pretty well understood by everybody.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, I certainly agree with the distinction. In fact, um, and I guess the question is almost sort of one could though apply it in two different directions. One could say, God was just forming the nation, so our complaints were more justified then, and by now we should have sort of figured out and understood it. On the other hand, as God was just forming the nation, we had more of a direct kind of sense of God, perhaps, and therefore we could question after everything God was doing for us right in that moment, choosing us and relating to us, why the complaints were less justified then, and now after such a long period of God's hiddenness in some sense, our complaints against God maybe feel more justified. So I think it's an interesting point, kind of how the stages of history allude to Rav Yitzhak Greenberg in particular and his three eras that we talked about in our rabbi's book club as we just read his book, but how stages of history or periods in our relationship with God, might be another factor to think about when we think about evaluating our complaints or critiques. So I
And
appreciate
I
that.
also, if I may add, I wonder that the people who left Egypt, the Israelites, comprised only, as I understand from the Midrash, 20% of all Israelites living in Egypt. So who were those 20%? They were probably those who had the worst of lives, who were really the slave laborers.
Yes,
But the other 80% maybe didn't have it quite as bad. They didn't feel a need to leave. I
yes,
mean, that's what seems logical, although I don't know if there's any facts supporting this.
yes. So I think that that's a good analysis, and indeed, I mentioned on Shabbat that I do think there's a connection that's made midrashically, because the midrash, when it talks about the plague of darkness, it says that during the plague of darkness, God killed the Israelites who didn't want to leave,
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
and gave their fellow Israelites the opportunity to bury them under the cover of darkness, so that the Egyptians would not see it and say, "Oh, God kills them and God kills us. They're not so special."
Uh,
And who were
Oh,
these wicked Israelites who were killed? So the Midrash says that they were ones who had Egyptian patrons, and therefore they had osher v'kavod. They had relative wealth and dignity in Egypt, and therefore they didn't want to leave. So I think that midrashic thread absolutely supports your contention that the 20% that left were the ones who had it the worst, and the ones who
right.
didn't want to leave were the ones who had some more uh, security and well-being. Although what's not clear to me in that midrash is whether those who were killed in the plague of darkness were really the entire 80%. Again, if we coordinate those midrashim or not, but I think it's a really interesting point.
And if I understand, the 20% who left were the totality of some 600,000
Right.
souls. Yeah. So what
Yeah.
left behind was maybe 2.3 million,
Yeah.
a sizable amount of
Yes.
people.
Yes.
Although in a nation of Egypt, I don't know, there were probably 40 million people there, so still a small part.
Yes. Yes. Thank you, Peter. Thank you. David L., a thought?
Yeah, I was surprised by I was surprised by the blending of Moshe and God in this essay. And what I thought was missing from the essay was the idea that there really were three parties, at least three parties in the dance. There's God, there's Moshe, and there's Bnei Israel.
Yeah.
And what I thought was strongly missing here was a sense of what's the role of leadership
Yes.
in helping people to understand where they are and to guide their response. You
Mm-hmm.
know, a leader doesn't get to choose the challenges that they face.
Yeah.
Nor do they generally get to choose what's going to be the zeitgeist of the people when you come into it.
Yep.
So I think this was a pretty a fundamentalist read, thinking about Bnei Israel being in relationship with God, and we as moderns have a greater sense of distance, whether
Yes.
it's because of what Rav Yid says or not. And the second piece is I thought there was a Cookian perspective of the nation having an identity of its own,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to it being a dynamic, organic thing
Yeah.
that can express itself, but also be shaped.
Yeah. Two great comments. I think absolutely there's even as much as there's these different, textual cues and context that she's looking at, there's a kind of a flattening of the interlocutors or counterparts to Bnei Israel as God and Moshe being very distinct, and we lose out on the piece of Moshe's role here. And I think that's important. And right, also thinking about the fact that there are right missing from this list are the explicit rebellions against Moshe's authority, because those aren't complaints about material, basic necessities being lacking, but there's just more to this picture, and how Moshe reacts, and when it's articulated as against him, I think are all and what his role is are all very important. And I think again also appreciate that second comment, kind of about what is the dynamic nature of the people and how it could develop and evolve. It's missing. Great, great. All right, we're past 9:30, and thanks to everybody for coming along for this journey. Hopefully, we come away with some textual analysis tools for reading the stories of complaint. We also have some pieces that were suggested, missing in the analysis that we also want to add in. And I also think, to me, it really does speak in a just daily life way to how do we respond to moments of, scarcity of resources or just not having what we want, and where do we orient those responses, whether they start out internal, maybe we voice them, to whom do we direct them, how do we formulate them, how do they impact us. I certainly, really, one of the things that sticks with me is kind of being concrete and specific. What am I missing and what is it that I want, as opposed to, from the perspective of whining and complaining. Um, uh, Certainly a topic in our household.
Could you
So,
just tell me the name of the commentator? I came in a few minutes late.
yes.
Last week I started with the 410, 470, 34, and then I had to come to the
Okay.
613. This week I started with the 613, and I was sitting there and nobody was there, and I had to switch to the other.
Okay, I'm
I,
glad you found us, Edith. And it's Dr. Brachi Elitzor is her name. She's going to be the one whose essays we're reading throughout the book of Shemot.
oh,
So we got
what's
a
her
few more
name?
weeks. Dr. Brachi Elitzor.
Could you spell the last name?
I'll text it to you.
Okay.
Great,
Are
great.
you going to use her comments the whole session? Okay.
Yeah, for the rest of the book of Shemot. So a number
Okay.
of weeks more. Yep, yep. And always take the opportunity to take a peek at my calendar. I think next Monday night we should be clear to go. So looking forward to it.
Thank you.
Good week to all. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Be in touch if you need anything. Love to mom and dad. And good night.
Thank you. Lila Tov.
Lila Tov.